An Arab millionaire in a wheelchair marries a humble young woman, but on their wedding day, she runs away, and the reason leaves him in shock. Before we dive into the story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Enjoy the story. Layla Al Fahim was a 25-year-old woman, the only one among her sisters who was still unmarried. Her parents had always hoped she would marry a wealthy man who could lift their family out of poverty. That day, her mother arrived home with news that shattered Layla's sense of security. "Layla, we need to talk," her mother Hanan said, her voice tinged with urgency. Layla sighed and glanced at her father, Tariq, who looked uncomfortable, while her mother wore an eager smile. "We have good news for you," Hanan began. "We received a marriage proposal." Layla froze. "From whom?" she asked hesitantly. "From Zayd al-Rashid," her mother announced, barely able to contain her excitement. Layla's heart pounded. Everyone in the city knew that name. Zayd al-Rashid was a reclusive millionaire, a man of wealth and influence, but also shrouded in mystery. He had been in a tragic accident years ago, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Some said the accident wasn't just a simple tragedy, but no one knew the full story. "Is this some kind of joke?" Layla asked, her voice trembling. "It's not," Tariq said, his voice firm. "Zayd is a powerful and generous man. This is a unique opportunity for our family." "But why me?" Layla asked, suspicious. "Zayd needs a wife to maintain his social standing," Hanan explained. "You are young, beautiful, humble, a perfect match." Layla knew there was no room for refusal. Her family had struggled for years, barely making ends meet. A marriage to Zayd would mean financial security for them all. But the idea of marrying a man she had never met, especially one with such a mysterious past, left her uneasy. "You'll have everything you've ever wanted," Hanan insisted. "He's respectable, generous, and he will take care of you." Layla's heart pounded. Zayd wasn't just a wealthy man. He was a man with secrets. And secrets always came at a price. "I need to meet him first," Layla declared, her voice firm. Her mother nodded hesitantly. "He's sending a car to pick you up tomorrow." That night, as Layla lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she felt a weight settle on her chest. Zayd could either be her salvation or her downfall. When the car arrived the next day, Layla stepped inside without looking back. The ride was long and silent, her mind racing with uncertainty. As the vehicle pulled into the grand estate, she gasped. The towering columns, the sprawling gardens, the sheer magnitude of wealth, it was unlike anything she had ever seen. Inside, she was led to a spacious hall where she finally saw him. Zayd al-Rashid sat in his wheelchair, exuding a commanding presence. His firm posture, sharp features, and piercing gaze unsettled her. "Layla," he greeted her, his deep voice steady and controlled. "Thank you for coming." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "I hope we can get to know each other before making any decisions." Zayd smiled, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. As if he, too, was hiding a truth she wasn't ready to hear. The air inside the mansion was heavy, filled with an aura that seemed to reflect the man before her. Layla could feel his gaze studying her, assessing her every reaction. "I hope your journey was comfortable," Zayd said, his voice calm. Layla nodded. "Yes, thank you for having me." He gestured for her to sit. Layla hesitated before lowering herself into a chair across from him, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Zayd watched her with quiet intensity. "Your mother spoke highly of you. She says you're determined and loyal." "I hope she told the truth," Layla replied carefully. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "I value truth, Layla. It's the foundation of any lasting relationship." His words sounded more like a warning than a reassurance. Layla's unease deepened. "Why me?" she asked, unable to hold back her curiosity. "You could choose any woman." Zayd tilted his head slightly. "Because you're different. I don't want alliances based on status or superficial interests. I want someone who understands the value of true partnership." Layla felt the weight of his words. but wasn't sure if she could trust them. How could someone so powerful and reserved choose a woman like her? I won't lie, Zaid continued. My life isn't easy. After the accident, I lost more than just the use of my legs. I lost my trust in people. Layla wasn't expecting such a confession. Zaid didn't seem like the kind of man who would reveal his vulnerabilities so easily. I understand your situation isn't simple, Layla said, choosing her words carefully. But I also need time to understand what this marriage really means. Zaid nodded slowly. And you'll have all the time you need. But know this, I don't make promises lightly. Before she could respond, a housekeeper entered the room, discreetly announcing that dinner was ready. Zaid gestured for her to follow him to a dining room that was elegant, yet free from excessive extravagance. The dinner was calm, but every word exchanged carried weight. Zaid asked about her childhood, her dreams, her ambitions. In turn, Layla tried to uncover details about him. She discovered that he was deeply invested in charitable projects, particularly in education for underprivileged communities. I believe education is the key to breaking the cycle of poverty, Zaid said firmly. Layla agreed, impressed by his vision. But even as their conversation deepened, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was being carefully left unsaid. When dinner ended, Zaid escorted her to the foyer. Thank you for coming, Layla, he said. I hope tonight was the first step in getting to know each other. Layla looked at him, feeling a mix of respect and distrust. Thank you for having me, Zaid. There's still much to think about. He gave her a small smile, but the intensity in his eyes carried an unspoken promise. As she left the mansion, the cool night air brushed against her face. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Zaid was a fascinating man, but he was also an enigma. Something deep inside her warned that agreeing to this marriage would change her life forever. The next day arrived with a storm of emotions for Layla. Despite trying to remain calm, the thought of accepting Zaid al-Rashid's proposal felt like a decision being made for her, not by her. Her mother, Hanan, was especially excited. She tidied their small home and prepared tea for Jalil, Layla's uncle, who was coming to discuss the details of the proposal. Layla sat by the window, her gaze lost beyond the horizon. She knew that once Jalil arrived, there would be no room left for hesitation. When Jalil entered the house, his firm posture and authoritative voice filled the small space. Zaid is offering more than just marriage, Layla, he said, sitting across from her. He will ensure not only your safety, but also the future of our family. Layla raised her eyes to her uncle, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind his words. What exactly does he want from me, she asked. Jalil took a deep breath before answering. He wants a wife who will be his partner, someone to help him rebuild his life and maintain his position. In return, he guarantees you'll never have to worry about money again. Hanan smiled, full of hope. Layla, this is a blessing. We can't let this opportunity go to waste. A wave of pressure engulfed Layla. And what does he expect from me as a wife? She asked, her voice quieter now. Jalil hesitated before replying. Respect and loyalty. Zaid is a practical man. He's not looking for a marriage built on luxury or romance. He needs someone who will stand by him, someone he can trust. Jalil's words echoed in her mind, blending with the memory of the previous night at the mansion. Zaid was a straightforward man, but there was a weight behind his words that she couldn't ignore. He's willing to give you time to adjust, Jalil continued, but sincerity is essential to him. And what if I refuse? Layla finally asked. Hanan immediately grabbed her daughter's arm. Don't say that, Layla. Think about your family. Think about what this means for all of us. The room fell silent. Layla knew that refusing wasn't truly an option. Her family depended on this alliance. And Zaid, despite being an enigma, seemed to be the only one who could provide the stability they so desperately needed. I need more time to decide, she said, trying to regain some control. Zaid is a patient man, Jalil replied, but he needs an answer soon. Think carefully, Layla. This decision isn't just yours. After Jalil left, Layla locked herself in her room, overwhelmed by the feeling of being swept into something far beyond her control. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, as doubts and insecurities battled inside her mind. Hours later, a message arrived on her phone. It was from Zaid. I hope you've had time to reflect. I'm available if you need to talk or have any questions. The decision must be yours. Layla read the message several times. Zaid was direct, but he was also respectful. There was something strangely comforting about his approach, even if the pressure to accept felt unbearable. The next morning, she made a decision. She needed answers. She returned to Zaid's mansion, determined to learn more about the man who could become her husband. When she arrived, a housekeeper led her through a quiet pathway to a private garden at the back of the property. Zaid was there, sitting under the shade of a large fig tree with a book in his hands. When he noticed her, he closed the book and smiled faintly. Layla, I'm glad you came, he said, gesturing for her to sit in a nearby chair. She studied him carefully, trying to understand him. I came because I still have questions. I want to understand what you expect from this marriage. Zaid nodded. That's fair. Ask whatever you want. Layla took a deep breath. Why would someone like you, with all your wealth and influence, need an arranged marriage? Zaid crossed his arms, his expression serious. Because not all wealth can buy trust or companionship. My position attracts people who see me as an opportunity, not for who I am. I want a partner, not a business transaction disguised as a marriage. His words struck her unexpectedly. Layla had assumed Zaid was a cold, calculated man, but now she sensed something else, something sincere. I'm not like the women you're used to, she said cautiously. Zaid smiled slightly. That's exactly why you're the right choice. Layla felt her face flush, but stayed firm. And what happens if this doesn't work? Zaid leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. Then it will be your choice, and I will respect it. But I can promise I'll do everything I can to make it work. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the fig tree's leaves. Layla still had doubts, but she was starting to see that Zaid might be more complex than she had imagined. I need a little more time, she finally said, standing up. Zaid nodded. Take as much time as you need. The decision must come from your heart. As she left the mansion, she felt torn between doubt and an unexpected curiosity about Zaid. Deep down, she knew that whatever choice she made, it would change everything. Days passed in a whirlwind of emotions. Zaid's proposal loomed over Layla like a constant shadow. Every conversation with her mother or Jalil only reinforced the idea that accepting the marriage was her only choice. Despite her doubts, she knew time was running out. Then, one morning, the decision was made for her. A messenger arrived with formal documents outlining the terms of the marriage, including financial security for her family. It was official. The wedding would take place in 2 weeks in a private ceremony at the Al Rashid estate. Layla watched as preparations for the wedding began. Her mother, Hanan, was practically glowing, overseeing every detail with enthusiasm. Layla, choose the most beautiful fabric for your dress, she urged. You're going to be an unforgettable bride. Layla simply nodded, still struggling to process how quickly her life had changed. That same day, she was taken to a renowned seamstress to have her dress adjusted. The light white fabric felt unbearably heavy on her shoulders. As the days passed, Layla found herself consumed by questions. What did she really know about Zaid? He seemed sincere, but there was something in his eyes that made her believe he was keeping secrets. On the other side, Zaid was equally involved in the wedding preparations. Despite his reserved nature, he ensured that every detail was taken care of. For him, the wedding wasn't just a formality, it was a chance to prove to himself that he could still build something meaningful, even with the physical limitations he had faced since the accident. But even in their brief meetings, Layla noticed something peculiar. Zaid always steered their conversations toward her. Rarely did he share personal details about himself. "You never talk about the accident," she remarked during one of their meetings, breaking the silence between them. Zaid's expression hardened slightly. "Some memories are better left in the past," he said. Layla felt uneasy. She knew Zaid wasn't the type of man to reveal his vulnerabilities easily. But something about his reluctance to discuss the accident told her there was more to the story than he was letting on. That night, as she stared at her wedding dress hanging near her bed, Layla realized something. She was about to marry a man she didn't truly know, and whatever secrets Zaid was hiding, they would soon become hers too. The night before the wedding arrived, bringing with it an unbearable weight pressing on Layla's chest. The Al-Rashid mansion was silent, a stark contrast to the frantic preparations that had filled the halls for days. Everything was ready. The guests had begun to arrive, the final decorations had been put in place, and her wedding dress hung in the corner of her room like a ghost of the future she had not chosen for herself. Sitting at her dressing table, Layla stared at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that this marriage was her only choice, that it was her duty to her family. And yet, something inside her refused to settle. Feeling suffocated, she left her room and wandered through the long corridors of the mansion. She needed air. She needed space. Her feet led her to the library, a quiet, dimly lit room filled with shelves of old books and a lingering scent of aged paper. It was the only place in the house where she felt somewhat at ease. As she moved toward the bookshelves, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the spines, her eyes landed on a slightly open drawer in Zaid's large wooden desk. A strange sensation crept over her. Curiosity took hold. Hesitantly, she pulled the drawer open and found a folder, marked with a name that made her heart stop. Tariq Al-Fahim, her father's name. Confused, she flipped the folder open and scanned the first page. A police report. Her breath hitched as she read further. It detailed the disappearance of Ahmed Al-Fahim, her older brother. Layla's hands trembled as she turned the next page, only to find something far worse. A letter, signed by Zaid al-Rashid. The words blurred in front of her eyes, but the meaning was unmistakable. Zaid had known about Ahmed all along. He had been involved, indirectly or directly, in the events that led to Ahmed's disappearance. Layla's world shattered. Zaid had known her brother had been caught up in something dangerous. He had known exactly what happened to him, and yet he had never said a word. The weight of betrayal crushed her chest. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Layla panicked. She shoved the papers back into the drawer and slammed it shut just as the door opened. Zaid entered, his presence commanding as always. He looked at her curiously. "I couldn't sleep," he said, walking toward her. "I thought I might find you here." Layla's heart raced. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I needed some air." Zaid tilted his head, studying her. "Are you all right?" Layla swallowed hard, fighting the urge to scream. He knew. "Zaid," she said, forcing herself to look at him, "I need to ask you something." "Of course," he replied, his voice calm. "My brother, Ahmed." She took a shaky breath. "Did you know what happened to him?" For the first time, Zaid's expression changed. A shadow passed over his face. He was silent for a moment too long. Then, finally, he spoke. "I did." His voice was lower now. "And it's something I've carried with me." Layla felt like the ground had vanished beneath her feet. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she demanded, her voice breaking. Zaid took a step closer. His face was unreadable. Because I knew it might drive you away, but I needed to make things right. Make things right? Layla let out a bitter laugh, her vision blurred with tears. Did you think marrying me would fix the past? That it would erase what happened to Ahmed? Zaid lowered his head. Number, I never thought that. But I did hope I could protect you. I wanted to give you and your family a life without struggle. Layla backed away. You used me, Zaid. No, he said firmly, his voice rising. I fell in love with you, Layla. My desire to marry you is real, but I knew I had to be honest with you about Ahmed. His confession left him vulnerable. But Layla was overcome by shock and pain. She couldn't listen anymore. She turned and ran through the halls, up the stairs, into her room. She slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. Her mind raced in turmoil. Her family had pushed her into this marriage. Zaid had manipulated it, and now she knew she had to leave. Before dawn, Layla packed a small bag. She dressed in simple clothes, covered her face with a veil, and crept through the quiet corridors. Outside, the cold morning air hit her like a slap. She ran through the garden, past the towering gates, onto the empty street beyond. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. Back at the mansion, the house was waking up. The staff prepared the final touches for the wedding. Guests arrived, filling the halls with quiet excitement. Zaid stood in the grand hall, observing everything. And yet, something felt wrong. A housekeeper approached him cautiously, her hands trembling. "Sir," she whispered, "there's a problem." Zaid turned to her, his dark eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "It's Layla," the housekeeper said. "She's gone." For a moment, time stopped. Zaid's grip tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. His jaw clenched. "Check again," he ordered, his voice like steel. "She must be somewhere in the mansion." Minutes passed, then an hour. Layla was nowhere to be found. Zaid closed his eyes, battling the storm inside him. He knew exactly why she had run. He also knew this wasn't over. "I want every gate checked," he commanded. "Find out where she went." The wedding hall, once filled with anticipation, now buzzed with murmurs of confusion. Guests whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. But Zaid ignored them. He retreated to his office, staring out the window. His mind replayed every moment with Layla. Every word, every glance, every step that had led to this. "She's not coming back," he murmured. Outside, Layla boarded a bus heading far away. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she could never return. Layla sat in the back of the bus, her body pressed against the window as she watched the city disappear behind her. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the road, vast and indifferent to the chaos inside her heart. She had escaped, but freedom didn't feel like victory. The truth about Ahmed burned in her mind. Zaid had known all along. He had been connected to her brother's disappearance. Yet, he had never told her. Had he been responsible? Or had he simply known the truth and kept it from her? Her heart clenched with frustration. She had fled, but deep down, she knew she needed answers. Back at the Al-Rashid mansion, Zaid sat motionless in his office, his fingers gripping the arms of his wheelchair as his staff scrambled to find Layla. Minutes later, one of his men entered. "Sir, we've tracked her," the man said, hesitant. Zaid lifted his head. "Where is she?" One of the drivers saw her boarding a bus heading toward the village of Al-Hamra. Zaid didn't hesitate. "Get the car ready." His uncle, Jalil, who had been silent until now, frowned. "Zaid, maybe you should give her space." "No," Zaid said, his voice sharp. "She needs to hear the whole truth." Jalil sighed, but he knew Zaid well enough to understand there was no changing his mind. Within minutes, Zaid's car was speeding down the dusty roads toward the village. Inside the vehicle, he was silent, his thoughts a storm of guilt and urgency. When he had first met Layla, he had thought only of atonement, of fixing the damage that had been done. But now, everything had changed. Now, he wanted her back. Not because of guilt, not because of duty, but because he loved her. Layla arrived in Alhambra just as the sun began to set. The village was small and quiet, with sand-colored buildings and narrow streets. She found an inn on the edge of the marketplace and rented a modest room. She didn't know how long she would stay, but she knew she needed time to think. She had barely set down her bag when a knock sounded at the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knew who it was. Taking a shaky breath, she opened the door. Zaid sat in his wheelchair in the hallway, his dark eyes filled with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "How did you find me?" she asked, gripping the door frame. Zaid didn't answer. He simply wheeled himself inside. Layla stepped back, crossing her arms. "I have nothing to say to you." "But I have something to say to you," he countered, his voice steady. Layla clenched her jaw. "I already know the truth. You knew about Ahmed. You knew what happened to him." "Yes." His calm admission sent fresh anger surging through her. "Then why didn't you ever tell me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Zaid exhaled slowly. "Because I wasn't sure of everything. I spent years trying to uncover the truth. And when I finally did, I realized how much it would destroy you." Layla stared at him, her nails digging into her palms. "What really happened to him?" she whispered. Zaid hesitated, but then he spoke. "Ahmed was involved in a conflict between rival families," he said. "He thought he could fix things, but he was in over his head. I tried to help him. I tried to warn him." Layla's breath caught. "You were there?" Zaid's jaw tightened. "Not the night he disappeared. But I had been trying to negotiate a peace between the families. Ahmed trusted me." Layla's heart twisted painfully. "And you failed him." Zaid's gaze darkened. "I did." The admission sent a wave of raw emotion crashing over her. For years, she had imagined Ahmed as an innocent victim. But now, she was seeing a different reality. Ahmed had chosen to be part of something dangerous, and Zaid had tried to help him. She swallowed hard. "Do you know where he is?" Zaid's eyes flickered with something, hesitation. "No," he said. "But I know who does." Layla felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. She should have been furious. She should have slammed the door in Zaid's face. But instead, she whispered, "Who?" Zaid leaned forward slightly. "If I take you to them, will you come with me?" Layla hesitated. She had run from him, convinced he was her enemy. But now, she wasn't so sure. After a long pause, she nodded. "Yes." The next morning, Layla and Zaid left Alhambra together. The journey was long and tense. Layla said little, her mind racing with anticipation. They arrived at a remote estate in the desert. A man named Khaled, once a key figure in the rival family, had agreed to meet them. As they entered the estate, Khaled sat in a large courtyard, watching them with unreadable eyes. Zaid spoke first. "You know why we're here." Khaled exhaled slowly. "Yes. You seek the truth about Ahmed al-Fahim." Layla's heart pounded. "Do you know what happened to him?" Khaled studied her carefully. "He is dead." Layla staggered back, the world blurring around her. "No," she whispered. "That's not... He can't be..." Khaled's voice remained steady. "It happened years ago. Ahmed was caught in an ambush. He tried to escape, but he didn't make it." Tears burned Layla's eyes. All these years, she had hoped. She had imagined him alive, waiting to come home. But he was gone. Forever. She turned away, pressing a hand against her mouth to muffle her sobs. Zaid remained silent, watching her, his expression unreadable. Khaled spoke again. You should know. He fought bravely. He did what he believed was right. Layla's chest ached. None of it mattered. He was still gone. She turned to Zaid, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. You knew this was a possibility, she said, her voice breaking. Zaid nodded. Yes. Layla's fingers curled into fists. Then why did you bring me here? Zaid's expression softened. Because you needed the truth, he said gently, and you deserve to hear it. Layla stared at him, raw and exposed. She had hated him. She had believed he was her enemy. But now she saw him for who he really was. A man who had made mistakes, but had never stopped trying to do the right thing. A man who had never abandoned her, even when she had run from him. Layla took a shaky breath. Ahmed was gone, but she wasn't, and neither was Zaid. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to run anymore. The journey back from the desert estate was silent. Layla sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the vast emptiness of the dunes, her mind as barren as the landscape before her. Ahmed was gone. The truth weighed heavier than she had ever imagined. She'd spent years hoping, praying, convincing herself that he was still out there, that one day he would return. Now there was nothing left to hope for. And yet, beneath the unbearable grief, there was something else. Relief. Not because Ahmed was gone, but because the questions were gone. She didn't have to wonder anymore. She didn't have to lie to herself. The truth had set her free. She turned her head slightly, looking at Zaid. His hands rested on the armrests of his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Layla had wanted to hate him. She had wanted him to be a villain, but he wasn't. He had tried to save Ahmed. He had searched for answers when no one else had. He had carried the burden of guilt alone. And most of all, he had never given up on her. She swallowed hard, shifting her gaze back to the horizon. I don't know how to move forward from this, she admitted softly. Zaid exhaled slowly. Then, we'll figure it out together. Layla closed her eyes. She had spent so long believing she had to bear everything alone. Maybe she didn't have to anymore. When they arrived back at the Al-Rashid mansion, Layla expected the weight of everything to crash down on her. Instead, she felt light. Her mother, Hanan, rushed to embrace her the moment she entered the foyer, her face streaked with dried tears. Oh, my daughter, she cried. We thought, She pulled back, gripping Layla's face between her hands. Where did you go? Layla hesitated before answering. To find the truth. Hanan's expression faltered. She looked at Zaid, then back at her daughter. And, did you? Layla nodded. Yes. Hanan's lips trembled, but she said nothing more. She only held Layla tighter. Jalil stood nearby, his expression unreadable. So, what happens now? The question hung in the air. Zaid wheeled himself forward. His voice was calm, steady. Layla, the choice is still yours. Layla turned to him. For the first time, she saw not just the powerful, untouchable man everyone else saw, but a man who had spent years fighting his own demons. A man who, despite everything, had been honest when it mattered most. For weeks, she had felt trapped in this marriage, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But now, she realized something else. She had a choice, and she chose him. Taking a deep breath, Layla stepped forward. Zaid, she said, voice quiet but firm. Ask me again. Zaid blinked. What? Layla's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Ask me again, she repeated, without obligations, without contracts, just us. A long pause stretched between them. Then, for the first time in weeks, Zaid smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Layla's breath hitched. I had a feeling you'd say that, he murmured. He opened the box, revealing the ring inside, a simple yet elegant band that shimmered in the dim light of the hall. Zayd's voice was softer this time. Layla Al-Fahim, will you marry me? The words felt different now, because this time, it wasn't an arrangement. It was a promise. Layla swallowed the lump in her throat. Tears stung her eyes, and she said yes. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the sky painted in soft hues of gold and pink. Layla stood in front of the mirror, dressed in white. This time, she felt no weight, no hesitation, no fear. Hanan stood beside her, adjusting the delicate veil draped over her daughter's shoulders. "You look beautiful," she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. Layla met her mother's gaze in the mirror. "I feel free." Hanan smiled through her tears. "That's all I ever wanted for you, my love." A knock sounded at the door. The wedding was small but perfect. The garden was adorned with soft white flowers, the warm desert air carrying the sound of laughter and quiet conversation. Zayd waited at the altar, his suit perfectly tailored, his dark eyes locked on her. Layla walked down the aisle with quiet confidence. For the first time, she wasn't stepping toward a life someone else had chosen for her. She was stepping toward her own decision. When she reached Zayd, he took her hands in his. "You look radiant," he whispered. She smiled softly. "You don't look too bad yourself." The officiant began the ceremony, his words full of meaning, about love, about trust, about the courage it takes to build a future together. When it was time for the vows, Zayd spoke first. His voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "Layla, I never expected you, but now I can't imagine my life without you. I promise to be worthy of your trust, your love, and your heart." Layla felt the tears slip down her cheeks. She took a deep breath and spoke. "Zayd, you showed me that even the deepest wounds can heal. That love isn't about perfection, it's about honesty. I promise to walk beside you, no matter where life takes us." Zayd's eyes softened. The officiant smiled. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Zayd squeezed her hands. "Are you ready?" Layla exhaled. "For anything." And as their lips met, as the applause rose around them, as the world seemed to quiet in that single perfect moment, Layla knew. She had made the right choice. She had found her place, not as a pawn in a marriage of obligation, not as a prisoner of secrets, but as a woman who had chosen love on her own terms. That night, as the stars glittered above the Al-Rashid mansion, Layla and Zayd sat side by side in the garden, their fingers intertwined. The past still existed. The scars would never fully fade, but they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. What did you think of Layla and Zayd's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more emotional stories like this one.